So there are plenty of videos out there telling you what tools you should buy. But today I want to talk about 5 tools that I personally regret buying for my woodworking shop. And these tools aren't necessarily bad quality, they're just tools that I haven't ended up using as much as I should have over the years. They're collecting dust, taking up space, and I can sell them and fund future tool purchases because we all like buying tools, right? So let's go ahead and get started with tool number 1. So tool number 1 is not this oscillating belt sander. This comes later in this video. Tool number 1 is on the other side of this flip top stand, which I built basically for this tool. And I haven't flipped this flip top cart in years. I don't think I ever even flipped it at my last shop, which means it's been over 5 years since I've even used this tool. So let's flip this thing around and I'll show you which tool it is. I forgot I'd added a clamp here to hold this thing down so I could actually flip the flip top stand. So tool number 1 is my hollow chisel mortiser. And in case you guys aren't familiar with what this tool is, because they're a little bit niche, as the name implies, it uses hollow chisels to create mortises. It's essentially kind of like a fancy drill press. They work great, and I used my old hollow chisel mortiser. Yes, this is my second hollow chisel mortiser. I used my old one on multiple projects. It worked great, and I honestly can't really remember why I upgraded away from that tool. I got my first hollow chisel mortiser used off of Craigslist for around 200 bucks and used it on some arts and crafts dining chairs. I used it to build the crib for my kids, and it was great for that. These really excel on projects with a lot of spindles because they can create square holes, which is really difficult to do with almost any other woodworking tool. I ended up upgrading to this hollow chisel mortiser before the last project where I used this tool, and I haven't used it since. And that's the point I want to make. Before making a tool purchase, you really should put some thought into just how much use it's going to be getting, because this tool was not cheap. Now it goes for $1,000. I know I didn't pay anywhere near that. I think it was around $500 or $600, but still, as you can see, this thing is almost brand new. I used it on literally one project. I already had another hollow chisel mortiser that ended up selling, and it was just a poor upgrade decision. This tool is very specific. It's great for a few things. For instance, if you do a lot of arts and crafts style furniture, they have a lot of spindles, a lot of through tenons, that kind of thing. They're great for this. My buddy Mike Farrington uses his all the time. But for the style of furniture I make, it just didn't make sense because I have a Festool Domino. Plus, there are tons of other ways to make mortise and tenon joinery without one of these tools. And I'm a big fan of Alton Brown, the cooking show host, and he classifies some kitchen gadgets in a similar category and calls them unitaskers.
For years, I have railed against the use and manufacture of what I call unitaskers. If you buy these items, you use them and then they simply pile up until you have to tear down your house and build another one.
And I personally think the hollow chisel mortiser is kind of a unitasker. It's a one-trick pony. It does one thing really well, but unless you're doing that one thing, it's not very useful. So I am definitely going to be selling this thing. So if you're in the Asheville, North Carolina area and are looking for a new hollow chisel mortiser, hit me up. So tool number 2 on my list is a tool I don't actually even own anymore, and this is the other version of that tool, and that is the Domino XL. So when I was first looking at getting a Domino, I wanted to make sure that it was going to do everything I possibly needed, because obviously this is one of the more expensive handheld tools in my shop, if not the most expensive. And so I had the Domino XL for a while, and after maybe 4 years of use, decided to sell it and get the regular Domino instead, and that was for a few reasons. For one, the Domino XL is really bulky. If you haven't used it or compared it to the regular Domino, the DF500, the regular Domino is already kind of heavy, whereas the Domino XL is probably close to twice the weight. And what I figured out is that most of the projects I was using my Domino XL on, I could use the regular Domino and have a lot easier time managing it. I wouldn't get as exhausted throughout the project. And overall, I think it's just an easier tool to use and interact with. The other major downside to the Domino XL is that it is extremely expensive. The Domino is already extremely expensive at $1,200. Add another $500 to that, and you'll get the Domino XL coming in at $1,700, which is just crazy, crazy expensive. That being said, I do think there are some specific use cases for the Domino XL. If you guys are building larger, kind of like 4x4 style table bases, that kind of farmhouse style, they're great for that. I used it on a project like that. Also, if you do a lot of breadboard ends, which I also did a project on, they are excellent because you can get that nice floating breadboard in really easily. You can draw bore the dominoes, looks great, holds up awesome over time. And so I think in those two instances, it is very handy. But if you're working with mostly, 8 quarter stock, doing things like basic table bases, panel glue ups, that kind of thing. I think the regular Domino is just a lot more versatile. One nice thing is that Festool stuff really maintains its value. And I think I sold the Domino XL for like 10% less than retail value when I went to sell it. So could easily pay for my regular Domino. And I know a lot of people scoff at Festool stuff, but they really do maintain their value. So you can consider it an investment into your woodworking. So moving on to tool number 3 on the list, that is this Powermatic air filter. And as you can probably tell, this thing has seen a lot of use in my shop, which might make you question, why do I regret getting this tool? And that is because of the replacement filter cost. With any tool in your shop that has consumables as part of it, you need to think about how much it's gonna cost to keep running. So this air filter is kind of unique in that it has this metal mesh screen that catches some of the bulk dust. And then if you take this front cover off, there's this additional air filter inside. The trouble is, this air filter costs $150. Now, the whole unit is $500. So if I were to replace the filter 3 times, I would have been better off going ahead and buying a new unit. And I personally think that's kind of insane, especially in the world of shop air filters. There are tons of inexpensive options out there. You can also DIY your own air filter, which is something I want to do in the future. I stumbled across this video series from 3D Handyman. He's done an awesome job comparing the different styles of shop-made air filters, and his unit can move a ton more air, and I can replace all of the filters for half or less of the cost, which makes it a no-brainer in my opinion. So now I have this $500 air filter and I don't want to buy the replacement filter, so what do I do with it? The other thing I really don't like about this style of filter is that it's proprietary as far as I can tell. Whereas most other shop filters use basic HVAC style filters with some sort of kind of bag filter inside, you can easily get replacements from any number of brands on Amazon or wherever. Whereas if Powermatic decided to stop supporting this filter, I'd be kind of dead in the water. So that's just one thing I'd keep in mind, especially with things like cordless tools or things with any sort of consumable part. If that company is not going to keep supporting it, are you going to end up with a very expensive paperweight? So another tool I no longer own, but I figured my larger version would be a good stand-in for it, is my Benchtop Jointer. And I think when you're getting into woodworking and you start watching YouTube woodworking videos like mine, like any of the other people I was watching when I got started, people like Mark Spagnolo, Bob from I Like to Make Stuff, Dave Chudo, Jimmy DeResta, Matt Cremona, those were kind of my main influences and inspiration when I was jumping into the woodworking world. It seemed like I absolutely had to have a jointer as soon as possible. And so I did what I think a lot of people do, it was to try to find the cheapest jointer I could get my hands on, which ended up being a Benchtop Jointer. And while it worked for the few projects I used it on, I very quickly realized that it was just not the right tool for the job. And that's because most Benchtop jointers just fall short in a lot of categories. For one, they don't have enough in-feed and out-feed support for any longer boards. So if you're working on something like a tabletop or anything longer, you're gonna run into issues. Also, they're underpowered usually. The one I had ran on 120. Maybe if you're overseas and 240 is the standard, they'd be a little bit more powerful, but for mine, it would very easily get bogged down. And number 3, it really wasn't that much cheaper than a used version of a kind of stationary floor standing jointer that I could have picked up on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. Now, I do think there are some specific use cases where a benchtop jointer can really come in handy. For one, if you have a very small shop space, obviously a jointer takes up a ton of floor space. Also, if you build smaller projects, if you're, let's say, a guitar maker, and the only thing you use a jointer for is jointing the seam between 2 halves of a body blank, I think that'd be perfect. That was actually the project that I used my benchtop jointer on first, was building a thin line Telecaster. And it worked great for that because most guitar bodies are only like 16 inches long, so it didn't need a ton of in-feed and out-feed support. Besides that though, I think you're better off holding off, saving up your money, and using other methods to get a nice clean straight edge or flat face in the meantime. For instance, there are all kinds of table saw jigs you can use to get a nice straight square edge. You can also use a track saw, and I think that's a much better investment early on in your woodworking career. And then to get the faces nice and flat, you can use something like a planer sled or just buy your lumber already surfaced on 2 or 3 sides. If you're good with them, you could even use a hand plane to get a nice clean glue joint. I'm not that good with hand planes personally. I don't really like sharpening, so I have not really ever used a plane to joint an edge of a board, but I know that it can be done. It was done that way for hundreds of years before the electric jointer was invented. But I think my point here is that I know it can be tempting to buy every tool you possibly can early on. but I think it's much better to invest in better quality tools and upgrade them as your budget allows into something that's gonna last a long time, because you're obviously gonna lose money if you're constantly buying and selling tools. I need to flip the flip cart back around to show you the next tool on my list. So let me do that. Whoa, that's heavy. All right, and then tool number, let me get my notes. And then tool number 5 on my list is this oscillating belt sander and spindle sander. And this was another tool I purchased because it seemed like everybody had one. It seemed like it was something I needed to have. And as it turns out, I didn't really need it. For one, I think this thing kind of feels like a toy. It has a lot of plastic on it, which I personally don't really want to see in a $300 woodworking tool. It has this weird drop-down table, which I've never used the drop-down feature. I think it'd be better off if it was just a solid flat platform. It has very bad dust collection. There is no shroud around this sanding belt, so you're gonna end up with tons of dust all over the place. And then it's kind of a pain to get the belt tracking properly, to change it from belt sanding mode to spindle sanding mode. And as it turns out, I just almost never use a spindle sander in the type of projects that I build. And I even very rarely use this belt sander because it's so little. And so what I wanna do is sell this tool, sell my hollow chisel mortiser, maybe sell it as a package if somebody's interested in it, and then upgrade to something like an edge sander, because I think having a longer sanding belt would make it a lot more useful for sanding the edges of pieces that I'm working on. Those also typically have a lot better dust collection because the belts are longer. They don't get as hot, they don't get gummed up as easily. So you can get edge sanders on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist for $500 or $600 if you wait for them, whereas this is $300. So honestly, I think you're a lot better off, again, unless you're in a very small shop where you can't afford the room for something like another floor sanding tool. I think you're better off holding off on a purchase like this and getting something that's a little bit higher quality. One other note I'll make is that when I built this flip top stand, I built it much taller than my buddy Brad from Fix This Build That's plans called for, so that I could afford to put the hollow chisel mortiser underneath and still have it swing around. But that put the working height of this way too high. As you can see, it's like basically at armpit level, which is way, way too high. You can imagine trying to work with something up in the air like this. It's pretty awkward. So if you are gonna put it on a stand, I would definitely put it, kind of closer to waist height to working height. So that's my list of tools that I have regretted purchasing for my shop. If you guys have tools that you've regretted purchasing, go ahead and leave them in the comments. I would love to see those. Also, if it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell. And last, I'll link to some tools that I actually do use in the video description below if you want to check those out. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.